Michael Korda is a novelist and the former editor-in-chief of the publishing giant Simon & Schuster, where he worked for more than 40 years. Korda has recently authored a new release titled Passing, a memoir of love and death. In it, he chronicles the journey of his life with his beloved wife of 40 years, Margaret, and her cancer diagnosis that ultimately led to her death in 2017. The pair both loved riding horses and first met in a fairy tale manner as they were both trotting along a similar path through New York's Central Park. Korda remembers Margaret as a strong and healthy woman who stayed very active throughout her 70s. She kept riding horses every day on their farm and the surrounding fields of their New York countryside abode. But in April 2016, Korda says something changed when she started to mysteriously drop her horsewhip while riding. Margaret, however, didn't give it a second thought and merely attributed it to aging.
But what in fact was happening is that Margaret could no longer feel that her hand was on the whip. She was losing all sensation in the fingers of her right hand.
As everyday tasks grew harder, the couple started to fear that something was very wrong.
She was beginning to find it difficult to do things like button her buttons, do up the hooks of her bra, put on her hair clip in the morning. All the sort of small things that you do normally and without thought were becoming more difficult for her. And she did not complain about that. And I must say that I did not notice it, which I should have done, but that was what was going on. When it got more severe and it became apparent there was something wrong, Margaret leapt to the conclusion that perhaps she'd had a small stroke, although she showed no signs of having done so. And that's what launched us on the path of getting MRI, which revealed that she had a large malignant melanoma brain tumor.
Looking back on that period before the diagnosis, Korda has some regret that he didn't take action sooner.
I, frankly, didn't notice all that much that anything was wrong. I mean, it could be attributed to fatigue. It could be attributed to aging. She was, after all, age 79 and still leading the life of somebody who was in their 20s or 30s or 40s. So there were plenty of explanations for what was happening. And it's only in retrospect, when you look back on it, that you say, well, we should have done something about that right away. Feeling guilty about that, up to a point, yes, of course, but what good would it do?
The discovery of the brain tumor was a ticking time bomb, and it had already started chipping away at Margaret's mobility and coordination. But despite the grim odds, she was a fighter and underwent brain surgery as well as radiation in the 6 months directly following the diagnosis. However, after those months passed and the disease worsened, the inevitability of her rapidly progressing illness started to set in.
The question of a cure, of returning, as it were, to her life before the diagnosis was no longer a possibility. So these are two different states of mind, because you throw yourself at first into the whole question of how do we fix this? How do we get it better? How do we get her back on her horse? Who do we go to see? What's the treatment? Where's the best place? Which is the natural thing to do. The second part of the year, none of that is really an issue, because it's clear that we're not going anywhere. And that the question is no longer how to fix what's wrong, but how to cope with the fact of Margaret dying.
There's no playbook or process for how to deal with the reality of losing a lifetime spouse.
The question is no longer what's going to make her better. The question is how do you make her comfortable, and how do you deal with getting her to accept the fact that she's died.
Accepting and grieving the death of a spouse or anyone you love is a complicated process, and it's one that's not often discussed until we find ourselves in the thick of it.
Because we don't talk about grief very openly or honestly in this culture, we don't know what's normal inside of grief. So things that are normal inside grief, grieving a long-term partner or any other intense loss, things like cognitive changes will happen, a sort of a sense of unreality, right? Whether the loss was sudden or the loss was almost expected because of a long-term illness or injury, there's a sense of unreality that comes after that, especially when you've been living with somebody for decades. They're stitched into the fabric of your life, and suddenly they're not there anymore.
That's Megan Devine, a psychotherapist and an expert in grief support. She says losing a spouse or someone you're close to can sometimes elicit a sense of unreality because everything in life suddenly looks a lot different.
That instinct to call somebody or text them on your way home, or you're at the grocery store, whatever that looks like right now, and you see their favorite food and you go to call them or text them, and then you realize that you can't do that anymore. So those tiny little bits of everyday life, those little intimate moments of everyday life, I think those can be really surprising and shocking for people when they bump up against them.
And for Michael Korda, who lost his other half to cancer, it can be especially hard to comprehend that someone you've made a lifetime of memories with is gone.
For people who lose their partners in those later years, not only does the person die, but whole worlds die. Very often this is the person who has been witness to such a deep, vast history with you. And it's not that people who lose a partner in the early stages of life don't lose that, but it's like more of history is lost.
In the book Passing, a Memoir of Love and Death, Korda recounts the process of accepting Margaret's diagnosis and subsequent death a year later. He says writing this memoir didn't help him grieve the loss of his wife, but it was cathartic in that it helped him remember and cherish the last year of her life.
I didn't feel that the book reconciled me to what had happened. So Passing, I think, will help people understand the process. Not the process of death, because actually you don't really have to understand anything about death. It's going to come, and when it comes in whatever form it takes. But the process of dying, and that is really what it's about.
Megan Devine is no stranger to loss either. In 2009, Matt, her partner of 5 years, accidentally drowned when he was suddenly swept away by a strong river current. The sudden loss thrust Devine into a long period of grief and eventually made her question the ways we treat those who have lost someone.
I think the tricky thing is that we look at deep loss as a transformational gauntlet, and that's not fair. Some things just hurt, and there's no silver lining in them. And therapists, honestly, were some of the worst people to talk to in those early days and weeks after Matt died, because they pushed that transformation narrative. What do you get to know now that you didn't know before he died? Like, what is that? At his funeral, people were coming up to me and saying, "You're going to be such an amazing therapist having gone through this," as though I wasn't a good therapist before. So that narrative, bad things happen to make you better, is deeply stitched in the culture. It's certainly deeply stitched in our professional language and our professional orientation to loss.
Devine says that while some people can give hurtful or unhelpful commentary, most people do come in with good intentions, even though sometimes it comes out the wrong way.
They're in a better place now. We hear that one a lot. If the person was in great pain before they died, they're in a better place now. That is not relevant. That may or may not be true, especially, considering the grieving person's or the surviving family's belief systems, but it's not relevant. I think the other thing to remember here is that we want to let the grieving person lead. If they're saying, "I'm so glad that they are free of their pain," then we can say, "Yes, I'm also glad they're free of their pain." If you're from the outside sort of prescribing, "Don't feel so bad because they're in a better place," that is probably not going to land so well for the person. Also things like, "At least you had them as long as you did. Some people don't get to have such great marriages." That also erases somebody's grief. Things like, certainly we're seeing now some people say, "You're so lucky that your partner died before the virus really hit. At least you could be there with them at the end." Those are all true statements. It's a really unkind thing to say to somebody.
If someone you love is nearing the end of life, Devine says have a conversation with those closest to you beforehand in order to somewhat prepare yourself for the grief to come. Talk to your friends and family about the best ways they can show support when you need it. Also, talk to them about what you don't want. Sometimes it's as simple as communicating that a hug or just being there in person on certain days is better than any words of encouragement or positivity.
The thing to remember is that there is no one right thing to say. There's nothing you can say to take the person's pain away from them, right? When you lose somebody, your capacity and your ability to advocate for your own emotional needs kind of goes out the window. We would love to say that, when you're grieving, you should tell other people what you need. Well, that's a lovely pie in the sky dream. We don't always have that capacity in times of great distress to talk about our needs. So having those conversations ahead of time, talking to friends and family and saying, I don't really do well with unsolicited advice, and can we talk about how we talk to each other when we're having a hard time? So I anticipate that when my partner dies, I'm going to need to talk about it. And I don't want to be told to cheer up. I don't want to be told to remember the good times. Can we talk about some better ways that we can be there for each other?
Being a caretaker or being close to someone with a terminal illness can be an all-consuming period. But it's also important to care for yourself and your future mental health by reaching out to those who can support you. To find out more about our guests, Michael Korda and Megan Devine, visit viewpointsradio.org. You can find Korda's book, Passing, a Memoir of Love and Death, on Amazon.com or through your local bookstore. Visit Devine's personal site at refugeingrief.com. For more behind the scenes, check out Viewpoints Radio on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price. Coming up on Viewpoints.
If you speak to some of the young protesters on the streets, they even say they're willing to die for them.
The ongoing fight for democracy in Hong Kong. Then,
I always found the first foods, like the first oyster or the first person to drink milk, kind of the strangest.
The questions you never knew you had. I'm Marty Peterson.
and I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.